Hello, my name is Andrew Holman and I'm the owner of MD Clutches. Today we're going to be looking at regreasing the dual mass system in the flywheel of the Ferrari 348 and Ferrari F355. They're very similar systems, but this actual model here is from the 348 GTB, so one of the last ones that were made. And why are we bothering to regrease this system? Well, 15-20 years old is pushing the life of this grease, and with the heat that's caused in here, it starts to get runny. The symptoms of runny grease are that you could have all of it running down to the bottom here, causing problems with hot starting because it's so out of balance. You could also have grease leaking out and contaminating the clutch plates, and that of course you don't want. To regrease it, we need to take it apart. It's a fairly simple job, but you do need to take care. You need a lot of cleaning of all that old grease. And you also need to use the special Kluber grease that Ferrari used in the first place. We've tried others, they don't work. So what we're going to do is turn this pumpkin here into this here, which is a fully refurbished example. We start off first of all with a quick visual inspection, and we can see from the front here there's a couple of aftermarket nuts on here, which if it was a Concours car we could look at turning back to original, and somebody's painted the bottom Ferrari sign, this is the bit that pokes out underneath of the back of your car, red, which again is not how it came out of the factory. Turning it over, we can look and see that it's an AP racing clutch. Now, Ferrari used a variety of clutches in the 348. They started with a twin plate Valio, changed over at some point to a single plate Valio, and there doesn't seem any rhyme nor reason with tying up with model numbers when they actually changed, and then finished up with the AP Racing single plate clutch. So it's always a surprise when you open up to actually find which one that you've got. We're looking down here at the dust that's from the friction plate, and it's always nice to see that it's a nice dry dust and there's no grease in there, there's no contamination there. There's also no oil there either. If you look down the middle here, we want to make sure that's dry because that would indicate oil leaking from the triple seals from the gearbox, and again will be getting onto your clutch plate and causing problems. The diaphragm springs here in the pressure plate, we can check that they're all flat, they're not too worn, and it looks like it's a good plate for refurbishment. And so now we're ready to start dismantling. Turning the unit over again, we need to take off the cover plate for the locking bolt at the back here. 13mm nuts, quickly and simply removed. Lifting the cover off reveals the locking nut for the flywheel system. This is a major locking nut. It's tightened up to over 400 Newton meters, and so you need the special tool to undo it and to do it up. This one's available from Hill Engineering. And you need the breaker gun that's capable of doing that job. Don't try it with anything less because it just won't work. Well, it works. And you can see here the remnants of Loctite as well that's been put in there, and this is the back bearing here of the unit. There's a little bit of grease around here, but nothing too much, not enough to worry about. Ideally now you need a hydraulic press to push the voice system out from the pumpkin bearing. And now we've pushed the voice system down out of the pumpkin cover, and here's where it starts to get a bit mucky. As you can see, the inside is covered with dust from the friction plates, and we like to clean that off, and when we do that, do a good visual check on it to make sure there's no cracking inside or anywhere, or no rubbing against any other components. This one looks good so far, but we need to do some more checks on it. But we can rest it aside for the moment there, whilst we carry on to get the clutch out. And here I use the handy rest here with a piece of foam with the hole cut in the middle for the nut. And we can now look at the clutch itself. With the clutch in the 348, you can see we've got a starter ring here mounted on top of the pressure plate, and this is held in by 3 bolts. With the 355, it's down further below. So we need to remove those 3 bolts first of all to get access to the clutch mounting bolts. This is usually held on quite tightly and we'll need to lever it up to free it off. Gentle prising all around, eventually it'll come free like that. And now we have the 9 mounting bolts for the clutch itself. These need to be done. I'm going to do the 2 outside ones, take them out, and then the inside ones we'll release a little at a time to ease the pressure up evenly. So we're now down to the last 3 mounting bolts, and I'll just switch over and undo these by hand so we can just release the pressure evenly as we go around. And this is how we'd do them up as well to make sure it's even. In fact, I've got a feeling this is going to be sticking down and is not going to be releasing automatically. We're going to have to just prise it off in a minute. Now let's just take these all the way out. Each of these bolts has a spring washer, and we'll show you later on that we supply new bolts and new spring washers with every kit, because these do get a little bit stretched and the spring washers lose a bit of their springiness. And we can now just ease this up. Oh. It's all a bit tight in here, isn't it? And once that's off, we can just lift it straight over and have a look at the condition that this is in. As you can see here, there's a bit of blue heat mark on the surface, but what's nice about it is not too much. It's nice and even all round and across as well. And that's looking good. But what we do need to do is just a check on how flat this surface is. And so we're going to lay a gauge across there. And as you've seen from the other videos, there can be some remarkable dishing in here where we can slip certainly up to 0.8 of a mil thickness card through there. But here it is actually one of the best condition pressure plates that we've ever had come in that I've ever seen. It's in remarkably good condition and going to be an easy job to refurbish. And underneath the pressure plate is the friction plate. This is the plate that connects the 2 flat surfaces together. It's the bit that wears out, and a bit like the brake pads in your car, it's the bit where all the dust comes from, hence all the dust that's beneath it here. What's interesting with this plate is that it hasn't got the wear grooves that you would normally see in friction material that run across the material here. Now, so we can't see at a glance how it's wearing. We need to measure that, and we can do that with a gauge, which we'll just check here to see what we've got. And we've got about 7.6, 7.5 on the inner edge, and that's down to 7.2 here on the outer edge. We'll just check that in a couple of other places. 7.6, 7.2. So we should expect to see a bit of dishing somewhere, but not too much. That's a pretty good, but there's obviously been a fair bit of wear in this plate. So we now can set that aside and move on to the flywheel. With the flywheel, well, it's dirty. There's a bit of grease around, as you can see here, not too much, but it has been splaying out a bit into the surrounding area. There's a lot of dust around that we need to clean up, and we've got again some heat marks on the contact surface there, but again not too many. So we need to check the flatness of that, and what I do there is with a hacksaw blade I've snapped this off to the right length to fit in here so that it fits in with the lip, and we can then look at how flat this is, and I can see a bit of light underneath it. There is a bit of a difference, but it's not too much. That's not going to take too much work to get that flat again. Having got this dismantled, there are some differences between the 348 and 355 that are easy to point out. As I mentioned earlier, the early 348s had twin plates in there, a twin clutch system that is a bit more complicated than this single plate one. The 355s had single ones as well. With the flywheel itself, we've got a central bearing here. Now, a difference with the 355 flywheel is that the bearing is actually in the flywheel itself rather than in the voith case that is here. And to get that out in the 355, you need to take this bearing out, carefully removing that, because there's a snap ring underneath that you need to get out first before you can take the flywheel off. Here, we're just going to turn it over and undo the bolts and push it out so that we can get the voith system apart. So we're now going to remove the flywheel. Turning it over again, we can see the back of the unit. One of the important things to remember here is that you need to find this spacer and check that that hasn't fallen out. That's the one that fits in there and that the nut tightens up onto. So we're putting that safely aside, and with still a lot of brake dust and dirt around, we're now going to use again another special tool that fits the splines of the flywheel bolts. These splines, I think they're commonly used in a Renault, and this is a Renault tool. It's an M8 socket that has the wide spline on it as opposed to the ordinary narrow spline style sockets that you see. Don't use one of the narrow ones, it won't work and it'll mess up your bolts, which are very difficult to replace, well indeed impossible. You have to buy a whole unit. So look after these bolts, and we'll just take these out. Quite a simple process there. And with the bolts removed, we can lift off the dual mass system to reveal the flywheel, and that's ready then to go onto our grinder in the machine shop. So this is the basic dual mass system here. This allows a bit of spring in the clutch and is a cushioning device inside here with springs inside, and this is what's filled with the Kluber grease. To undo it, it'll press out now because there are no more bolts that are holding it in, but to press it out, what we do is we look at these two little inspection bolts here. We're going to undo those, and with the special bolts that we provide with our regreasing kit, we're going to use these holes to gently push out and evenly push out the voith cover. One of the things that you must check here is that there is no damage to the outside edge of this cover. What we have found is that some of the clutch mounting bolts, when they're reused, bite into this cover at various points and can cause then the grease to leak out because it just pushes the side of the cover aside and lets that grease to flow out onto the clutch. So firstly, please use our replacement bolts. They're good quality, high tensile. They're also the right length and won't cause any damage to that cover. I'm pleased to say here that this one has no such damage. There is a bit of grease marking across it, but nothing much, and it's in good condition and ready to be taken apart now. So with my Allen key attachment in the gun, we just undo these bolts here. There should be a small copper washer, yeah, it's on there, just sealing it, because here we can see for the first time the grease and the state of the grease inside here. So I'm just going to poke an Allen key down there, and here the grease has a reasonable consistency. It's not as good as new grease, but it's still fairly firm. It certainly can't be described as runny, but then it is quite a cold day today. But it's pretty good. The colour is a grey rather than white, but that's to be expected. And so it is a good time to be replacing it. So with the plugs removed, we're now going to use the bolts that come supplied with the kit. These are an ultra fine thread, so they're not ones that you can pick up in your local shop usually, but don't use any others because of course you don't want that thread to be damaged at all. And the idea of these is that we're going to gently screw them down on each side, and that's going to push the front cover out against the seal. There's no ring that seals it in there, so it's gently going to push it out, and we're going to have access to inside the Voith cover. These are 17mm bolts here, and just a couple of turns each side will be pushing it down. Don't know whether you can see that, it's just starting to come down. There's not too much pressure at all on it. It's got a little crack there just to show that it's starting to open, and we're nearly there. Just a couple of turns more, I think. Now, that's ready to come off. I'm not going to do that just yet. I'm going to try and turn it over again. I'm also going to get a camera because it's important to look at where all the pieces come from originally so that you know that you're putting them back in the right places. So I'm going to just take out the bolts and turn it over and then start to get ready to photograph what's inside. Okay, so we've turned the Voith system over now, and we've got the lid all nice and loose and ready to come off. But just before I do, I'm just going to put a mark on the top cover and on the side of the system so that we know where it came off from, and I'm able to put it back in exactly the same place. It helps a little bit with the balancing to keep it in the same place. Although, of course, we do balance all our systems up afterwards anyway, but it's something that I just like to do. So with a sharp Stanley knife, we just cut a little mark into the side there and another one up the side of the casing there. And now we're ready to lift it off. So we're now ready to lift it up and check inside here. You need to be careful that there will be some bits that are stuck to the top cover, and we don't want those going missing at all. Now, quick inspection here shows that the grease is well contained within the cover. There's none coming up the outside. There's none going across into the middle or the seal here, which all looks in very good condition. The grease itself still has a reasonable consistency to it, so is still doing its job okay. Let's place that to one side, and now you can see the rest of the system here. And as you can see, there's a lot of grease and a lot of bits here. If you're doing this at home, then you need a lot of rag and a lot of cleaning fluid to actually clean it all up properly. And so on to degreasing. Of course, having a power degreaser helps speed up this process enormously, bringing the voith covers up beautifully in no time at all. The pumpkin itself takes a little longer. You can see here we have also removed the rear bearing. Even though it had some life left in it, we decided to replace it as a precaution. This is nothing you can't do at home, of course, with plenty of rag and some degreasing fluid or something like brake cleaner to help. Here, John also checks to make sure there are no hairline cracks or other signs of anything amiss inside the pumpkin. Once finished here, it's left to dry before we move on to some machines you probably don't have at home, starting with a power blaster. We're using a special bead in our blaster that is kind to the aluminium and brings it up as good as new. Meanwhile, the flywheel has been on the grinding machine, bringing that back to spec. This needs careful monitoring and measurement, of course, as we can only take so much off a flywheel before you will be needing one of our nice new ones. So, we now have a fully cleaned and degreased voith system. The pumpkin's off being cleaned and refurbished, and so is the flywheel and the clutch. But we've got these clean bits, and this is where I use an awful lot of kitchen towel because we want to keep everything clean as it's been degreased. As you can see here, we have an empty base unit. I've just put the brown seats in there, and what I'm going to do is just use half a dozen bolts and put these through each one. These are sort of temporary bolts just to help us line everything up. It's a handy little trick that keeps everything in place when you're bolting it up. So I've got 6 bolts we're just putting into place there. And I've got our Kluber kit here with the new grease in. These come in sealed pots, so you know that they haven't been opened, haven't been contaminated. There's a breakable seal on them, and they come in the right sizes. So for the 348, we're looking for 200 grams of grease. And I just use a what do you call it, an ice cream stick to help me with this. Then we have the new seals, and there are 12 of these small little chaps and 1 big one. So we're going to start by putting the small ones on, and what I like to do is just give them a little dab of grease so that they stay in place. So we've got 1 over each of these bolts going down into the recess at the bottom that you'll see. So that's the O-ring space at the bottom, and we now have the spacers that go on top of those. And again, just placing it over, the bolts and pushing it right down. If you can remember which way round these came off, that would help. I always find it useful to put them back in the same direction they came off in. And now on top of those we put the spacers that keep the voice lid in the correct place. So those can just passed over these bolts. You can see why these bolts are so helpful now. So next we're going to put in the intermediate plate. This has had new bearings pressed onto it, and they should last the lifetime of this grease again. I'm just going to put a smidge of lubricant on the bottom there just to aid that going in, and that's placed between the bolts with the spring spaces lining up properly there. We'll press that down and that goes straight in. That goes in beautifully there. The springs, we've got the long and the short springs. There's a slight difference in the lengths of the holes here, and so we place those back basically where you took them out. If you get confused with these and all the bits go everywhere or whatever, then there are some good online guides to look at to help you through them. Now that's the springs back in place, and then we're just going to put, let's get that the right way round there. These go on the edges of the springs, the spacers there, so we're just going to pop those in there. Then there's some little springs here that have carriers that go into these holes, and we're going to pop those in there. Not going to put the tops on yet because we're now going to put some grease in. So you can see here the whole set out that is laid out here, and all these holes that you see here we're going to fill with grease. We're not going to put grease on the plate. We're certainly not going to put grease anywhere near this. We're just going to fill out the holes. Now, as I've said, you've got the right amount of grease here with 200 grams. You won't think it's enough at first, and then you will think how you're going to get it all in there. But by tucking it into the springs and so on, you will be able to do that. So we now have a cover here. This is upside down. I'm just going to put a bit of grease on the back of these. On there. That's just to keep them in place when I tip it upside down. Let's see, yeah, a bit like when you whip meringue enough. And the next step here is to get the large O-ring out from the bag, and we're now going to put this round the outside lip, in the outside lip of the voith cover. So that is reasonable tight fit. It goes in there with a bit of a snap, and that's beautifully positioned to go back on. But before we put the top cover back on, there's just the question of the top spacers that are going to go in. So we're going to put those again over the bolts and down onto the spacers underneath. And like I did with the bottom, I'm going to get the smaller seals and just give them a dab of grease. We're just giving the seals a dab of grease here just to keep them in place in the top cover. It's handy having a grease that's a bit more glue-like as well. And that's going through the hole. Let's get that properly there. And last one. Okay. So the cover, as you can see, is all complete there and ready to go. You just need to make sure that you're lining it up correctly. Now, if you remember, we put a line on the cover. There it is there, that marks that one. So I'm going to have that pointing towards you. And we're just going to look for the line here. Here it is. Okay, so that then means by flipping that, it's ready to go on. Now I want to make sure that none of those O-rings are disturbed, out of place. Basically, if they're over the bolts, then we're getting somewhere. That's all in place and ready to be tightened down and placed back, tightened up down onto the flywheel. And the flywheel goes on the top here, and then our bolts, the original bolts, not these temporary bolts, are replaced and tightened up on the flywheel to tighten all that down onto the bearing. So that's how to regrease a Ferrari 348 and Ferrari F355 dual mass system flywheel.